one of the Marines noticed some uniformed guys on top of the hill that were lookouts. And we ran around the side of the hill, and these guys that were lookouts, so to speak, they were coming down the backside of the hill, and we dropped them. About the time we dropped them, all hell broke loose. The guy who I went over the hill with, he was the first guy to go down. I moved from there, and I used him as a protection from the shells that were coming in at that point. I took one round through the hand, turned around and took off for the back. Before I got back to the first plateau, I got hit in the leg. Went down, of course, and while I was down there, enemy came up out of a spider trap and put one through my face. It was a very traumatic day. I was in a DCT program, education program, where you work a half a day during high school. And I worked in an electronics shop for about a year and a half. So I did pick up more than I thought I did. When I went in the Navy, they tested me, and I just aced the electronics area and probably failed the rest of it. Forrest Gump type. They gave me aviation electronics school, of which I really had not asked for, but that's what they thought I would do best at. Well, I caught pneumonia when I was in boot camp, and they put me in an isolated unit because meningitis broke out. And as I watched for some days, watched these corpsmen in there, I never knew what a corpsman was. Everybody in my family were truck drivers, construction workers, hard-working labor people, blue-collar workers. What I admired was the dedication that these guys had. And then the more I watched it, the more I thought, that would be nice to have that, because I had never been dedicated to anything. I went up to the, I forget what department you call it, requesting a change in my MOS. And they laughed at me. And they said, "What are you, an idiot? You have the best school the Navy has, guaranteed, and you want to become a corpsman?" They looked at each other and said, "Hey, have at it."
What was corpsman training like?
Difficult, really. The hospital corps training in that era was very intense. They say 16 weeks. It was more like 18, 19 weeks, depends on when you came in. It was harder than boot camp. You got up in the morning and you studied notes for the test that day, and you took your 3x5 cards and you read them over and over and over while you were marching to breakfast. And it was all day, every day. There was no liberty. There was no nothing. 18 weeks, and then you had the head of corps school, gave you these friendly advice. If you don't pass corps school, you'll be chipping paint for the next 4 years. Things were a little different back then.
Motivational tactics. Yeah. What were you primarily trained to do on the battlefield?
People have different thoughts about that. Hospital corps school was trained to give you theory, anatomy and physiology to the best degree they could teach you, and to make you think, improvise. And probably the improvise was the key to the whole thing. Understand your subject, understand the problem, do the best you could. In my case, we were directly in combat in the jungle, and the basic thing I saw was scrap metal wounds and gunshot wounds, and explosions and bullets.
How soon were you assigned to a Marine unit after you trained?
Well, I went through hospital corps school first, and then they send you to what they call Fleet Marine School, which is basically first aid, your adaptation between the hospital corps and the Marine Corps. When you come out of there, you're immediately assigned.
And where were you assigned?
You've been reading other things, haven't you? My first assignment was Force Recon. I had been around there long enough to know, Force Recon, I don't think I want to do this. Then I found out that as I was checking in to Force Recon that you have to volunteer in writing at that time to be in Force Recon. I looked at this poor clerk and I said, there's no way. He turns around and he says, Lieutenant, he won't sign. He says, well, get him out of here. Thank you. The next day I reported to Las Pogas on Camp Pendleton to a line company.
How quickly were you able to bond with those Marines?
The first company I was with, being in the service is all about leadership. There's good leadership, there's good teams, and there's bad leadership and bad teams. The first company I was with, I did not mesh with in any way, shape, or form. I requested to get out of that company and be sent to another company since we were assigned rather than part of the company. They didn't like that at all. I said, I want out of this company. It was going to be lethally a problem for me, and I knew that. My personality did not jive in any way, shape, or form with the NCOs, the leaders, and some of the lower NCOs also. Trouble was brewing, and I knew it. So the first class up in Battalion Aid Station looked at the chief, and he says, put him in Charley Company. Nobody wants to go to Charley Company. Chief said, you got it. He says, you'll be sorry about this one. Best thing ever happened to me.
What was it like meeting those guys?
Respect. From day one, from the commanding officer all the way through the platoon commanders down, it was almost bliss. They took me in and introduced me to every single guy in the company. It was like 240 guys. Assigned me to a couple of Marines and said, y'all get Doc set up and ready, and have him on the parade field at 8 o'clock. The care for those Marines started right there day one. And it was a matter of trust. You learn to trust each other. Actually, you learn to love each other. So it all grew from there. They took care of me, I took care of them.
So when did you deploy to Vietnam with C Company?
Charley Company landed over there in July of '65. We were around Charley Air Base for a week or two, and then they sent us out to a peninsula called the Ban Thong Peninsula. It was a stronghold for the NVA. We were patrolling jungle and getting hit on a regular basis.
And were you armed at all as a corpsman?
Well, corpsmen at that time, Geneva Convention said the only weapon you can carry as a personal weapon, which would be a .45. Now, if you carried a .45, there was only certain people in the company that would be carrying a .45. The radio man who had to have his hands free, so he had a pistol. The weapons platoons guys, that was their personal protection weapon. They also had another weapon that they used, and the officers. So you look like an officer. You do not want to look like an officer or a corpsman in combat. It's the first two guys they're looking for.
Let's talk about February 8th, 1966. That's the action for which you received the Silver Star. Tell me what happened that day.
Well, we were hitting a three-point ambush. I had like 9 guys down on one dike, and we had the rest of the CO and the half of the group that were out there. They were coming in from the flank through the side. Fortunately, they had to go through a pretty heavy slough of water before they got to that village. But all of a sudden, the place exploded, and the men went down on the main dike, and of course I went after them. By the time I got to the last one, Sergeant Sansel was there. Everybody that was hit was either dead or totally incapacitated. And I got out to the end of the dike, and the machine gunner is down. And the A gunner, who is supposed to be his assistant, carries the ammunition and takes over the gun if the gunner is out. He was gone. Couldn't find him. And they were lighting us up from 3 directions. I had been assigned to weapons platoon when I first went with the Marine Corps. And like I said, those Marines were all with me. They taught me how to use every weapon that was in weapons company, and obviously did a fairly good job at it because I was functional. So I grabbed the machine gun, loaded it up with 300 rounds, and started shooting the fire lines. Probably the biggest thing to that was, number one, quiet the enemy, because you couldn't hit them, they were that far away. Machine gun would be the only thing you could shoot out there that you knew where you were hitting, because it had tracer rounds in it. And the flank patrol that was coming in on the other end, they had no idea where these guys were. So I actually turned the machine gun over towards where I knew they were supposed to come in and tried to shoot over their heads and loaded them up so they would be very alert. I never knew whether they caught that idea or not until years later. By the time I got back to the guy that was out there, the sergeant that was out there, he was dead. Now, I mean, we lost 12 guys on that dike that day in one episode, Nobody came off that dike but me. When we tried to get back to our basic point where they started firing on us, we started getting action from behind us. We basically put that down, and then on the way out of there, we walked into a minefield, and another whole situation.
What happened there?
Well, we picked up our injured and got them out of there. And then we walked back. I guess you'd call it walked. How about run? We didn't have too many people left. It was a very bad day.
How do you regroup after something like that?
Probably psychologically is the biggest problem. You reorganize your platoons. You just deal with it. They wouldn't even let us go on patrol for 4 days because they were concerned about our emotional responses.
You know what drives me crazy? The cost of everything. Gas, groceries, and hearing aids. Thousands at a clinic? No way. When my wife had trouble hearing me, I got her MD hearing aids, and now she hears everything, which is great, mostly. This podcast is sponsored by MD Hearing, and they just cut their price in half. Their Neo rechargeable hearing aids are now just $297 a pair. That's over 90% less than clinic brands. They fit right in your ear, and the new Neo XS is even smaller. MD Hearing was founded by an ENT surgeon to make hearing care affordable. With over 2 million sold and a 45-day risk-free trial, it's a brand you can trust. Go to shopmdhearing.com and use promo code AVC to get a pair for just $297. Plus, get a free extra charging case, $100 value, just for AVC listeners. That's shopmdhearing.com, promo code AVC.
Okay, let's talk about March 28th now, 1966, the day that your actions were ultimately cited for the Medal of Honor. This is less than 7 weeks later from what we just talked about. Where were you on that day, and what was happening when things got bad?
We had like 5 mile tactical area of responsibility. We were on the southeastern area at that point. We knew that it was inhabited by a large number of NVA. Actually, we ended up landing in a landing zone that was not where we were supposed to land. But once you're down, you know. So we organized and took off. Came around a hill, and one of the Marines noticed some uniformed guys on top of the hill that were lookouts. And he and I had been already operating in combat for about 7.5, 8 months. He looked back and he yelled out, "Hey, Doc!" And we just automatically hit. We ran around the side of the hill, and these guys that were lookouts, so to speak, they were coming down the back side of the hill, and we dropped them. About the time we dropped them, all hell broke loose. They say they had 100 NVA dug in anywhere from 70 to 100 yards away from us in the rice paddy, and they basically decimated 3rd Platoon instantly. The guy who I went over the hill with, he was the first guy to go down, and I took off after him. He was on the lower slope. I took off after him, got to him, and we shared a couple of rounds. I moved from there, and I used him as a protection from the shells that were coming in at that point. I noticed the fire was coming out of this cane patch across the rice paddy, so I used all of his ammunition and most of mine trying to put that down, and it appeared that I was successful. I took 1 round through the hand at that point. Yeah, I kept a couple of rounds in the rifle and turned around and took off for the back. Before I got back to the first plateau, I got hit in the leg. Went down, of course, and got back up and ran. I found a couple of more guys. My first sergeant was back there. He was very dead. So I grabbed his ammunition and stuck his rifle down and took off for the next one. And there were plenty of people out there to take care of. Yeah. I got over to another area and saw one of the men down, so I got down on my knees to evaluate him. I was pretty sure he was dead anyway, and while I was down there, enemy came up out of a spider trap and about 15, 20 feet away, and put one through my face. It was a very traumatic day.
How were you able to keep focused on your job given your own injuries?
Well, it wasn't my first rodeo. I don't think I ever had any intent on coming back. It's amazing that the guys that I met back up with years later that went through all of this with me, every one of them intended on coming back. And I never could quite understand that, where's your brains? Count the numbers, Yeah. Third platoon had no one walking after that last day. After the round went through my head, laid there for a second and I reached over and realized my rifle was still in my hand. And I grabbed it and took off for the rest of the guys. Cleared a couple of hedgerows, and of course my hearing was pretty bad and my vision wasn't too sharp anyway. And I finally ended up down at the border of the rice paddy, close to the enemy. And I had 30 rounds left and nobody to be seen. The only guys that were alive in my company were 2 stages up on the hill, and I knew they were in bad shape. And then I started seeing the enemy was across the rice paddy, and I could see them with their little beanies on, more like images than anything else. So, the old sergeant used to tell me, nobody can tell where one fire came from. So you turn it on semi-automatic, line your sight up, take them out one at a time. Yeah. I got through one magazine and part of another one, and finally, all of a sudden, the whole hedgerow jumped up and ran off. That was both funny and scary. They were all over the place. But at that point, I started toward the back because I knew I was in pretty bad shape. I got about 1 tier up. It was like 5 tiers on the front side of this hill. I think I got to the second one and I just couldn't make it over it. Between the leg and the obvious mental, not mental, but dizziness, etc. I was trying to get over the second one and somebody's hand reached down and grabbed me and pulled me up. It was my commanding officer. He had come down from up above. He grabbed me, pulled me over, and he's doing the old belly crawl back, and he said, "Doc, you just stood up and walked back like you could give a crap less." I told him, I said, as many times as I've been shot, who cares? I had accepted my demise very quickly. That part didn't bother me at all. All I wanted to do was get out there and take care of my men.
How long did it take you to recover from your wounds?
Well, I was unconscious for several weeks. Who knows exactly what. I went back to B Med Battalion in July. They didn't do too much. Tried to stop the bleeding and had to have a tracheostomy at that point because I was bleeding into the lungs. And they sent me to A Med Battalion in Da Nang. And I remember waking up in Da Nang, the doctor was trying to talk to me. Next thing I remember was stopover in the Philippines, basically unconscious the entire time. They took me out of Philippines. We landed somewhere in Illinois, and from there to NAS Jacks, because that was the closest naval facility.
How long did you end up staying there?
Had a long time. They treated the head wound, they treated the leg wound, they debrided the leg. No serious surgery to the leg. Just stopped the bleeding and the muscles had retracted. So they cleaned it up and patched it together. Plastic surgery was a unknown profession at that time, so they just undermined it and pulled it over, and it worked. It's still working. Sometimes not too good, but it's still working. The hand, they tied the tendons and stuff back together on it, and ended up kind of stiff and messed up, and it worked out. Everything's still working as far as I know.
That's excellent. That's excellent. At what point did you learn that you had been nominated or put in for a Medal of Honor?
I had no idea. It was 1995. The 11 o'clock news just came on. I don't want to get emotional. My platoon commander called me on the phone, and of course I recognized his voice, and he mine, and we talked for about an hour, hour and a half. He didn't tell me at that point. We just talked, and the following Wednesday I called a flight over and met him at his condo in Alabama. We were walking down the beach, and he said, "What did you get for 28 March?" And I said, "What do you mean?" I said, "Purple Heart, what else?" And he says, "Are you not aware that you were put up for a Medal of Honor?" And I laughed. Why would I be put up for a Medal of Honor? I could give you blinded examples, All of those I left. I think we lost a total of 25 dead that day, if I remember the stats right, and about 35 or 40 wounded. Never really knew much about any of them after that time, till we met back up in 95. The rules for receiving the Medal of Honor were fairly stringent. The papers have to be dealt with within 3 years of the time of the action. And we're talking about 65 to 75. So we don't fall in that line. The guys that I was with in Vietnam are the ones who decided they wanted to make this thing happen. I wasn't particularly interested in having it. I'd been without it all those years. What's the advantage? Well, the advantage was getting us all back together. It had to go through Congress and get the rules changed. These guys who have gotten the medals since '98, they would have had to fight the same thing. My guys rallied. It went from 95 to 98, and it just would not get on the agenda. I think if it doesn't get on the agenda, it doesn't happen. Once it got on the agenda, it was doing its typical political crap. Up and down, and people talking about something they had no idea about. And upsets a congressman from Pennsylvania, retired Marine. And he begged time from someone else because he had no time. He stood up there and just laid it out. He says, "In case y'all don't understand, let me read this." And he read through it. And then he turned around and called for vote. He didn't have any time. He couldn't call for vote. Had to go back. So they called for vote, and it was unanimous. So that was good. Then he had all the investigation he had to go through. There was a tremendous amount of investigation. In '98, President Clinton's the one who put it around my neck, so we got it then. I had 25 guys left from Vietnam in that room. They didn't like that. You're allowed to have your mother, father, blah, 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 total number of 5. None of my family was there. My wife and children were there. That was it. Mom and dad, no. Brothers, no. And they didn't like that either. My real brothers came from Vietnam. The lady who ran that room where it was presented said to me afterwards, she said, you would have thought that they were all getting the Medal of Honor. I said, they were. If it wasn't for them, it wouldn't happen anyway. So it was a tremendous opportunity to get my group of guys back together. And that's hard to describe.
How has the medal changed you, if at all?
Got to do a lot of travel. I'm not a personality who likes the hoopla. Very much of an introvert, whether you can tell that or not. I'm not sure quite how to say this. Sometimes I'm embarrassed because I got it. And they didn't. They didn't get the recognition. It's almost embarrassing, the accolades that I get for what they did. What did I do? I was just part of the team. We had a very big team, damn good team, but I was just a part of it. Yet I get the accolades, and they get death. Kind of a slap